Hello and welcome to one and all. In today's class, we will move on to the next question, Keynesian theory of employment. Okay, so this is from Unit 8, Macroeconomic Analysis and LAQ number 13. Okay, so the question is, explain the Keynesian theory of employment. So just I'll give you the brief introduction and main features of the Keynesian theory of employment before proceeding with the answer. Okay, so the brief explanation. So J.M. Keynes, that is John Maynard Keynes, so he published a book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money. Popularly, this book is known as General Theory or Income and Employment Theory. Okay, so the other name for macroeconomics is also equal to income and employment theory or general theory. Just like microeconomics is referred as price theory, macroeconomics is referred as the general theory or income and employment theory. The reason is J.M. Keynes published this book in 1936, that is after the Great Depression of 1930s. Okay, so till 1930s, microeconomics was popular. And after the Great Depression, whatever the beliefs according to the microeconomics was proved wrong. There was a total disaster in all over the world. Okay, in almost all the countries of the world, there was too much of unemployment. The classical theory of full employment could not prove correct. Okay, so too much of disturbances, economic crisis in almost all the countries of the world. So then it was understood that it is not possible to study the economy from the microeconomic point of view. So it was necessary to look at the macroeconomic point of view, that is the economy or the country as a whole. So after J.M. Keynes published this book in 1936, then the macroeconomics became popular. Okay, now let us see what are all the main features of the Keynesian theory of employment. Okay, now the first one is the according to Keynes, the assumption of classical theory of full employment was proved wrong. See, now before 1930s, I mentioned to you that the microeconomics was popular. So at that time, the classical economists, so you know all the classical economists, the Adam Smith, especially JBC, Ricardo, they all are of the view that economy will always be under the conditions of full employment. Any country, there will always be full employment of all the resources in the country, land, labor, capital, organization. So even if there is a temporary unemployment in any economy, it will over a period of time, the full employment will be restored in any economy, because that was the assumption of the classical theory of full employment. I cannot say it was an assumption, because that was happening in almost all the countries of the world before the Great Depression of 1930s. No country faced any extraordinary problem of unemployment. Always the economy was coming back to the normal level. Always the employment situation was restored to the full employment level. So the classical theories, they frame their views that economy will always be equal to full employment. Unemployment will not be a problem in any economy, because according to them, supply will always be equal to demand. This is the very famous quote or assumption by JBC, supply always equal to demand, says law of markets. Okay, but the Great Depression of 1930s, it was proved that the supply was not able to create its own demand. There was too much of unemployment in the economy. There were too much of goods and services in the economy, but there was no demand for any commodity because of the level of unemployment. Okay, so when people are unemployed, when they don't have any money to any income to purchase, how will they demand the goods and services? So since there is no demand for goods and services, and already there was oversupply, the producers were not willing to produce anymore. Since the producers were not willing to produce anymore, then it resulted in more and more amount of unemployment in the country. So the supply was not able to create its own demand. And the classical economy, they also believed that the price mechanism, the market forces of demand and supply, just like how we saw in perfect competition, without any interference, the price should be allowed to go up and down without any interference by the government in the economic activities of the country. If the price mechanism is allowed to work freely, and there will always be it will bring an equilibrium between supply and demand. The country will be in equilibrium, and there will not be any unemployment of any resources in the economy. So there was no necessity for government to interfere. So this was the view or the theory of the classical economists. But all those things was proved wrong. So during the Great Depression in 1930s, there was too much of unemployment. Supply was not able to create its own demand. The price mechanism was not working on its own. So it was necessary that the government should interfere. So that was the opinion of Keynes, or that was the main feature of the Keynesian theory of employment. Okay, so according to Keynes, the second point, unemployment is a normal situation in any economy, not like the classical assumption that there will always be full employment in any economy. So according to Keynes, unemployment is a normal situation in any economy. Now the third one, the level of employment depends on something called as effective demand in any economy. Okay, so Keynes used three concepts, that is effective demand, aggregate demand, and aggregate supply. So through this, he proved that unemployment is the normal situation in any economy, and the level of employment in any economy depends on something called as effective demand. Okay, now what is that effective demand? Fourth point, effective demand in turn depends on aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Now if you remember, what is the meaning of aggregate demand? Aggregate demand is a total demand for all the goods and services in the country, and aggregate supply is the total supply of all goods and services in the country. When I say total supply of all goods and services in the country, that is equal to the total national output, which is equal to the total national income of the country. So aggregate supply is also equal to the total national income of the country. Okay, so because all these are macroeconomic concepts, we are not talking about we are not viewing the economy from the micro point of view. We are not viewing the economy from the individual point of view. Keynes viewed the economy from the macro point of view, that is economy as a whole. So that's why we have to check about the total demand and total supply of all goods and services in the country. So effective demand in turn depends on aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Okay, now Keynes said that unemployment is a normal situation, and the level of employment in any economy is depending upon effective demand, and effective demand depends on aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Okay, now what causes the unemployment then? Fifth point, deficiency in effective demand or aggregate demand. That I will explain to you later why I have mentioned or effective aggregate demand. I will explain to you later. So deficiency in effective demand leads to unemployment in any economy. Okay, so if the country wants to increase the level of employment, then what the country must do? The level of effective demand in the country must increase, because if there is a deficiency, if there is a shortage of effective demand in any economy, that will result in unemployment. Okay, so if the country wants to increase the level of employment, if the country wants to reach the level of full employment, then the country's effective demand should be increased. So in order to increase the effective demand, that's 6th point, hence the government must interfere to increase the level of effective demand and the level of employment in any economy, including the capitalistic economies. Because the capitalistic economies, the classical economists, starting from Adam Smith and all, they were all favor of capitalistic economies. What is a capitalistic economy? It is a laissez-faire economy, that is non-intervention of the government. The government should not interfere in the economic activities of the country. Then the price mechanism will work automatically, and the supply will be equal to demand, and there will always be full employment of resources, and the economy will be in equilibrium. This is the assumption of classical economists. But Keynes said that because of the Great Depression, he proved that the government must interfere to increase the level of effective demand and the level of employment in any economy, including the capitalistic economies. So even in the capitalistic economies also, the government must interfere to raise the level of employment. Okay, so these are all the main features of Keynesian theory. So I repeat again. So in any economy, full employment is not the normal situation. Unemployment is the normal situation. That is the first thing. Okay, and then in order to increase the level of employment and reach the level of full employment, the effective demand in the country must increase. Okay, and this effective demand in turn depends on aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And if there is a shortage of effective demand, if there is a deficiency of effective demand, and that is the reason for unemployment in any economy. So in order to increase the level of effective demand, then the unemployment in the country will also reduce, or in other words, the employment levels in the country will increase if there is an interference by the government. So this is the main feature of the Keynesian theory of employment, how the country with the intervention of government will increase the level of employment and reach the level of full employment. This is the employment theory of Keynes. So this he has explained with the help, as usual, with the help of an hypothetical table and the diagram. Okay, now if you understand these features, now we will move on to the main answer. Side by side, along with the answer, I will explain to you the points also. Okay, now moving on to the main answer. So the question is, explain the Keynesian theory of employment. So introduction, J.M. Keynes published a book named The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money in 1936, after the Great Depression in 1930s, in which he criticized the classical theory of full employment. That's what I told you. The classical economists, they assume that any country will always be under the condition of full employment. But Keynes criticized that assumption. So according to Keynes, unemployment is the normal situation in any economy and government must interfere to ensure full employment. So this was proved after the Great Depression. So every country was finding the unemployment as the normal situation, not the full employment, and Keynes proved that the government must interfere. Okay. Now Keynes explained his theory of employment through three concepts: aggregate supply, aggregate demand and effective demand. So these are called as the macroeconomic concept. Aggregate supply, aggregate demand and effective demand. These three concepts were introduced by Keynes, and these three were called as the Keynesian macroeconomic concepts. Now let us check out what is the meaning of aggregate supply, what is the meaning of aggregate demand, and what is the meaning of effective demand. Each of these you might even get for 2 marks, and only effective demand, part of it you might even get for 5 marks. The whole thing is very important for 10 marks. Okay, now first let us check out what is the meaning of aggregate supply. So aggregate supply, the abbreviation is AS. Okay, so aggregate means total, isn't it? So that is what aggregate supply is: the total supply of all goods and services produced in an economy with the given level of employment. So why I have included the sentence words with the given level of employment? Normally aggregate supply, what do we say? The total supply of goods and services. Now since we are talking about the theory of employment here, Keynes was talking about mentioning about the theory of employment here. So he included the given level of, stress the fact that the production of goods and services is possible only with a given level of employment. Okay, only with the employment of certain amount of labor force in the country, only with the employment of certain amount of land in the country, for that matter all the factors of production in the country, then the product, goods and services will be able to be produced in a particular country, isn't it? Now without the employment of labor force, is it possible to produce any goods and services in the country? It is not possible, isn't it? So if the, say for example, I am having a company, I am running a business, I am having some company, and I am employing 10 laborers. Okay, only with the employment of 10 laborers I am able to produce 100 units of commodity X, isn't it? So if I am able to produce 100 units of commodity X only by employing 10 laborers, isn't it? So suppose if I want to increase the output, instead of 100 units, I want to increase to 200 units of commodity X. So if I have to increase to 200 units, what I should do? Then I should increase the level of employment also, isn't it? So when I am employing 10 laborers, I am able to produce 100 units of commodity X. When I am employing 15 laborers, then I am able to produce 125 units of commodity X. When I am employing 20 laborers, I am able to produce 200 units of commodity X, isn't it? So that means what? The total supply of any goods and services, or all the goods and services in the country, depends upon what is the level of employment in that particular country. With this level of employment of labor force, so this many lakhs of labor force, this many crores of labor force, or this many thousands of labor force are employed in a particular country, and this much amount of labor force in a country, they are producing so and so quantity of goods and services in the country, isn't it? So that's why aggregate supply is the total supply of all goods and services produced in an economy with a given level of employment. Okay, now the second point, hence aggregate supply, that is AS, is equal to the total national income Y. National income is always represented by the alphabet capital Y. Okay, so total supply of goods and services is equal to total national output, which is equal to total national income, that is Y of an economy. Okay, now at each level of employment, there is a price known as aggregate supply price, that is ASP, which all the producers must receive after the sale of output, as ASP is equal to the cost of production. Okay, now I just mentioned to you, I am employing 10 laborers. Okay, so when I am employing 10 laborers, I am incurring certain cost of production. Okay, so let us assume after employing 10 laborers, then I am incurring cost of production equal to 50,000. Okay, so now these 10 laborers, they are producing 100 units of commodity X. So with the employment of 10 laborers, I am incurring let's say a very small business I am having. So with the employment of 10 laborers, I am incurring expenses towards wages to the laborers equal to 50,000. Okay, so now after I sell these commodities in the market, I should get this 50,000, isn't it? So if I am not getting, because 50,000 is my cost of production, I must receive this 50,000. So that's what, at each level of employment, there is a price known as aggregate supply price. So this 50,000 is my supply price. So like that, you take all the producers, in a country, that is the total supply price of all the producers in the country, which all the producer must receive after the sale of output. So I must receive 50,000 after selling this 100 units of commodities in the market. So suppose if I am receiving only 40,000 instead of 50,000, and then I am incurring loss, because I am incurring cost of production with the employment of these 10 laborers equal to 50,000. But after the sale of output, if I am earning one revenue equal to 40,000, then I am incurring a loss. Then what will I do? I will not employ 10 laborers. I will remove certain labor force, isn't it? So I must receive this 50,000. Like that, all the producers in the country must receive their certain amount of revenue after the sale of output in the market, which is equal to their cost of production, that is their aggregate supply price. Okay, now a schedule showing different aggregate supply prices at different levels of employment is known as aggregate supply schedule. Now schedule means table. So what it is say? A schedule showing different aggregate supply prices. So when I am employing 10 laborers, my cost of production is equal to 50,000. When I am employing 12 laborers, my cost of production increases to 55,000. When I am employing 20 laborers, my cost of production is increasing to 1 lakh. Isn't it? So at each level of labor force, my cost of production increases. So my supply price will also increase according to the cost of production. So if you are making it, arranging it in the form of a table, this much level of employment, this is the cost of production and this is the supply price. So when the level of employment increases, the cost of production increases, the supply price also increases. So like that, if you are arranging it in order and you are making it in the form of a table, that is what is known as the aggregate supply schedule. So again, when we are dealing with the table, you will be able to understand it better. Okay, now this is as far as aggregate supply is concerned. So all these are important for your 2 marks also. Now moving on to aggregate demand. So what is the meaning of aggregate demand? Aggregate demand is the total demand. Okay, so aggregate demand, the abbreviation is AD. So aggregate demand is the total demand. Total demand for what? The total demand for all the goods and services produced in an economy, again at a given level of employment. So that given level of employment is constant. Okay, so in simple Keynesian model, aggregate demand AD is equal to the total demand for consumption goods C and investment goods I, that is AD is equal to C plus I. So when we say the total demand for goods and services, there are so many goods and services produced in the country. Okay, so the very simple Keynesian model, very conveniently, very simply, we are categorizing the goods and services into 2 parts. Demand for consumer goods, that is consumption goods C, and the demand for producer goods or investment goods, that is I. So in the simple Keynesian model, aggregate demand is equal to demand for consumption goods and demand for investment goods. This constitutes the total demand for all goods and services. So that is aggregate demand AD is equal to C plus I. Just like aggregate supply AS is equal to Y, which is the national income, aggregate demand AD is equal to C plus I, that is the demand for consumer goods and the demand for investment goods. Okay, again, at each level of employment, there is a price known as aggregate demand price, which all the producers expect to receive after the sale of output, and aggregate demand price is more than the cost of production. Okay, now I think you can understand the difference between the aggregate supply price and the aggregate demand price. Okay, so I said when I'm employing the 10 laborers, I'm incurring cost of production equal to 50,000. So 50,000 is the price I must receive, that is aggregate supply price. But will any producer will receive one day, will be satisfied one day equal to the cost of production? Any producer will want more than the cost of production, isn't it? So even though my cost of production is equal to 50,000, I must receive 50,000, but I am expecting to receive 60,000, isn't it? Whether I am receiving it or not, that is a different issue. But even though my cost of production is equal to 50,000 after the employment of 10 laborers, still I expect I will receive more than 50,000 so that I can get more and more amount of profit. That is the normal tendency of all the producers, isn't it? So like that, all the producers, what they are expecting to receive after the sale of output, that is known as aggregate demand price, that is which is more than the cost of production. Again, at each level of employment, what the producers expect to receive keeps on increasing. When the level of employment increases, the cost of production increases and the aggregate demand price also increases. So if you are making it, arranging it in the form of a table, that gives the aggregate demand schedule. So a schedule showing different aggregate demand prices at different levels of employment is known as aggregate demand schedule. Okay, now I think you are clear with aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Now what is the connection between effective demand? I mentioned to you, aggregate effective demand depends on 2 factors, aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Now let us see what is the meaning of effective demand and what is the connection between effective demand and aggregate supply. So effective demand is at that level of employment where aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply and the economy will be in equilibrium. Because what the producers must receive is one thing, what the producers are expecting to receive is another thing. See, because I must aggregate supply price, I must receive only 50,000. But what I am expecting 60,000, isn't it? So like that, when I am increasing the level of employment, I must receive 55,000, but still I am expecting to receive 65,000. So at each level of employment, what I am expecting to receive, what I am receiving, I must receive, they both are different. But at one point, what I must receive and what I expect to receive, they both will match each other. What all the producers must receive, that is the aggregate supply price, will equal to what all the producers expect to receive, that is the aggregate demand price. They both will match each other, equal each other, and that is the point of effective demand ED. So that is equal to effective demand ED is equal to aggregate supply, which is represented by alphabet Y, which is equal to aggregate demand, which is equal to demand for consumption goods and investment goods, C plus I. So now what is effective demand? Effective demand is that level of employment in a country where the aggregate demand price is equal to aggregate supply price. Effective demand is that level where total demand for goods and services is equal to total supply of goods and services. Aggregate demand is effective demand is that level where what the producers expect to receive is equal to what they must receive. Okay, so that point is the effective demand, and the economy will be in equilibrium. Okay, equilibrium, the demand and supply matches, the economy will be in equilibrium. Okay, now just because the country has reached the effective demand, that doesn't mean the country is in full employment situation. Even when the country is in unemployment also, the economy will be in equilibrium. Okay, so that's what Keynes said. It is not necessary that just because the effective demand is there, the country will be in full employment. So the country, even though the country reached the effective demand or the equilibrium position, the country will be still in unemployment situation. So in that stage, in order to increase the level of employment, the effective demand should increase. That's why the deficiency in effective demand leads to unemployment. So according to Keynes, deficiency in effective demand or aggregate demand leads to unemployment, and the government must interfere to raise the level of aggregate or effective demand to attain full employment in any economy. Okay, so again, the deficiency in effective demand or aggregate demand, I will explain to you. Even though the effective demand depends on both aggregate supply and aggregate demand, the more influence is aggregate supply remains constant. So effective demand more or less depends mainly on aggregate demand than on aggregate supply. That's why we keep saying deficiency in effective demand or aggregate demand, they both are the same, leads to unemployment. So the government must interfere to increase the level of employment in the economy. Okay, now this I'll explain to you in the form of a table and diagram. You will be able to understand it better, and this is the way you have to write the answer also. Okay, now moving on to table. So the first column, you can see the level of employment, since we are taking the country as a whole in lakhs of workers. Second column is the aggregate supply price, ASP, and third column is the aggregate demand price, ADP. Now what you're observing from this table, so initially 10 lakhs labor force is employed. All the producers in a country together, they are giving employment to 10 lakh amount of workers. Okay, so this 10 lakhs amount of workers, they are producing goods worth rupees 500. Okay, sorry, this is aggregate supply price in crores. So even aggregate demand price, this must be in crores. So now this 500, they have all the 10 lakhs amount of labor force, they are producing goods worth 500 crores. Okay, now this is equal to, in other words, this 500 crores, this is equal to value of output. Okay, and value of output, which is again equal to cost of production. So that is why they must receive this 500 crores. Okay, so if all the workers in the country, 10 lakhs workers given employment in the country. So initially the level of employment in the economy is 10 lakhs. Okay. So now all these 10 lakhs workers, they are producing goods worth rupees 500 crores, that is equal to value of output. So then why we are saying it is a value of output? This is the cost of production. So all the producers must receive this 500 crores, that is the aggregate supply price. So if the producers, if they are not receiving this 500 crores, then they will not give employment to this 10 lakhs workers. They will reduce the level of employment. Okay. So that is the aggregate supply price. Now you can see that when the level of employment increases to 11 lakhs, then the cost of production increases to 550 crores. Then the value of output also increases to 550 crores, and the aggregate supply price also increases to 550 crores. So like that, when the level of employment keeps on increasing from 10 lakhs to 16 lakhs, then the value in the cost of production also increases from 500 crores to 800 crores. The cost of production also increases to from 500 crores to 800 crores. Then the producers aggregate supply price, that is what they must receive, also increases from 500 crores to 800 crores. Okay. Now this is aggregate supply schedule. So at each level of employment, there are different aggregate supply prices. So if you are making it in the form of a table, that is what is known as the aggregate supply schedule. Okay. Now this is the second column. Now move on to the third column. This is the aggregate demand price. So even though the cost of production and the value of output is equal to 500 crores, so this is what the 600 crores is what the producers expect to receive. So they are expecting more than their cost of production. This is the normal tendency of any producer. No producer will expect only equal to cost of production. They will always expect more than the cost of production. So they expect to receive more than cost of production. So this is the aggregate demand price, which is more than the value of output and more than the cost of production. And cost of production. So like that, when the 11 lakhs labor force are employed, the producer expect to receive 625 crores. When 12 lakh labor force are employed, the producer still increases the expectation 650 crores. Even though the cost of production is only 600 crores, the producer expect to receive 650 crores. So like that, when the level of employment keeps on increasing from 10 lakh workers to 16 lakh workers, then the aggregate demand price, that is what the producers expect to receive, also increases from 600 crores to 750 crores. Okay. So at one point you can see that when the, you can see together in everywhere there is a difference between the aggregate supply price and the aggregate demand price. But at one point when the level of employment is 14 lakhs, you can see that aggregate supply price is also equal to 700 and aggregate demand price is also equal to 700. So that is the point of effective demand. Okay. Understood. So what the producer expect to receive 700 crores and the producer must receive is also equal to 700 crores, which is equal to 14 lakhs. Okay. So now you can see that in this, as far as this table is concerned, you can see that there are 16 lakhs labor force. Okay. So but the economy reached the equilibrium even before employing the 16 lakh labor force. At 14 lakhs employment of labor force itself, the economy has reached the equilibrium position. So that means what? That is effective demand position is reached, then the economy is reached the equilibrium position. So this 14 lakhs labor force, it's underemployment equilibrium. So if the country wants to reach the level of full employment equilibrium, then the effective demand should be reaching at this point. When the 16 lakhs labor force is there, then if that point is where the effective demand or aggregate demand price is equal to aggregate supply price, then this is the point of full employment equilibrium. But the country has already reached the equilibrium, but that is the underemployment equilibrium. Now what you are observing here, you can see that because this is the effective demand. Instead of at 14 lakhs, it should shift to 16 lakhs. So this is why the deficiency in effective demand leads to unemployment. So there are 2 lakhs labor force unemployment is there in the country. Why that is happening? Because of the deficiency or the lack of effective demand. If the effective demand is attained at point where 16 lakhs labor force are employed, then that is a full employment. But the effective demand is already reached when 14 lakhs labor force is employed. So that is a unemployment equilibrium. So now if you have to increase the level of employment, then the producers are not willing to employ, because you can see that the producers, whatever they are expecting to receive, they are not receiving. So initially they expected 600 crores, they did not receive, they received only 500 crores. Next, 11 lakhs labor force, they expected 625 crores, but they were receiving only 550 crores. So like that, when the producers are not expecting what they have to receive, then they will not employ. See, you can see that before 700, before 14 lakhs employment of labor force, you can see that aggregate demand price is more than, up to here, aggregate demand price was more than aggregate supply price, isn't it? So 500 crores, 600 crores, 550, 625, 600, 650, 650, 675. So before 700, aggregate demand price was more than aggregate supply price. But that is, the producers were optimistic. They keep on thinking that I will receive, we will receive more than the cost of production, we will make more and more amount of profit. They were optimistic at the initial stages. Okay, but the consumers are not fools. When the value of the output is equal to only 500 crores, why should they pay 600 crores? When the value of the output is only 600 crores, why should they pay 650 crores? So the consumers are not willing to pay that much amount of money. So the producers are slowly, their optimism, they are losing their optimistic attitude. Slowly they understand that they are not receiving what they expect to receive. They are not able to make more profit than what it should be. They are not receiving more than their cost of production. And at 14 lakhs, you can see that aggregate demand price is equal to aggregate supply price. And you can see that after 14 lakhs amount of labor force were employed, the aggregate demand price becomes lesser than aggregate supply price, isn't it? So the 750 crores, but what they expect to receive is 725. Even though the cost of production is 800 crores, they are expecting the consumers would pay only 750 crores. So when the cost of production is 750 and they are expecting to receive only 725, that means they expect they are going to make losses, isn't it? So when their expectation is lesser than their cost of production, why would they employ the labor force? So at this point, aggregate demand price is lesser than aggregate supply price. So when the producer think that they will receive only lesser than their cost of production, 750 crores is the cost of production, but they were expecting to receive only 725 crores when they employ 15 lakhs amount of labor force. When they employ 16 lakhs amount of labor force, 800 crores is the cost of production, but they are expecting to receive only 750 crores, that is their aggregate demand price. So they know that beyond 14 lakhs amount of labor force, if they continue to employ the labor force, they are going to incur losses. The consumers are not going to pay that much amount of money, spend that much amount for the goods and services. So they will not employ the extra 2 lakhs amount of labor force. So the economy has already reached the equilibrium position before the level of full employment. Then who is responsible to provide this employment? The producers, they are not willing to employ more and more amount of labor force. They stop production. They are not interested in employing more amount of labor force. So in this case, in order to employ this additional 2 lakhs labor force, that is 15 to 16 lakhs. So in this case, the government must interfere. So only the government interferes. This government should enter into the economy. The government should start spending some money. The government should spend for some welfare activities in the country. So there is one more sector entering into the economy, starting to spent for goods and services. So from C plus I it will become C plus I plus G. So automatically what will happen, from effective demand in the country will increase. Now you can understand that aggregate demand increase. AD is the C plus I, isn't it? So if the government interferes, then it will become C plus I plus G. So then if the aggregate demand in the country increases, then automatically the effective demand in the country will also increase. So that's why Keynes said, if the government interferes, then the economy will reach the level of full employment. Okay, so the same thing we have to explain in the form of a diagram also. Okay, so the explanation in the above table, at 14 lakh level of employment, aggregate supply price is equal to aggregate demand price of rupees 700 crores. Hence, this is the point of effective demand. All the other explanation I have given you in orally. Okay. Now we will move on to the diagram effective demand. Okay. As usual, first draw the x-axis and the y-axis. X-axis we are mentioning the level of employment, and y-axis we are mentioning the aggregate supply price and aggregate demand price. Okay. Now first you have to start draw the aggregate supply curve. So aggregate supply curve is nothing but equal to national income. So that means what? Employment, as the level of employment increases, so this is also the national income. So they both, that's why it is a 45-degree angle. So they both increase in the same proportion. As the level of employment increases, the aggregate supply price also increases. So that's why it starts from the origin. So this is the first, I'm just drawing in the dotted. This is the way you have to draw the diagram. So first start drawing the aggregate supply curve. So up to certain level, it is increasing along with the, as the level of employment. Remember, it has to start from the origin, supply, and as long the proportion between the level of rise in the level of employment and the rise in the aggregate supply price, they both are equal, because as in other words, the x-axis represents not only the level of employment, it also represents the level of national income. Okay, so since they both are increasing in the same proportion, it has to be originating from the origin, and then it has to be 45-degree line. So up to a certain level, it is increasing in a steep line, and beyond E2 you can see that it becomes a straight line. Okay, where it corresponds to NF. So this NF is the full employment level. Okay, in our table this is the 16 lakhs. So this is the 16 lakhs employment of labor force, and this is the N1 is the 14 lakhs level of labor force. Okay, this is 14 lakhs and this one is the 16 lakhs. So if you remember, 16 lakhs already is the level of full employment. That's what is represented as NF. N1 is the 14 and this is the underemployment equilibrium. So beyond the level of full employment, that is 16 lakhs NF, there is no chance of increasing the level of employment, because the country already reached the full employment. So under that stage, if the aggregate demand keeps on increasing, then there will not be any more demand for goods and services. Then there is no chance of producing any more goods and services. It will lead to only inflation. So that is why beyond that NF, that will be in the form of a straight line. So that is the first curve you have to draw. So again I am mentioning here, this is step 1. Aggregate supply curve is the step 1. So as soon as you draw the aggregate supply, mark AS, and within brackets you have to mention this is Y. Okay. Now the second one is the step 2. You have to draw the aggregate demand curve AD1. Okay, so now aggregate demand, you can see that it starts from at some point on the y-axis. Okay, it won't start from the origin, it starts from the some point on the y-axis, because even though the level of employment is 0, even though people are not employed, they will still spend. Consumption will never become 0. Maybe out of past savings or something, they will still spend for goods and services. So aggregate demand AD1 is equal to C plus I. So some amount of expenditure will always be there. So that's why it doesn't start from the origin. It starts from at some point on the y-axis. So and as the level of employment keeps on increasing, the aggregate demand price will also keeps on increasing. So this is AD1, but it will not be as steep as aggregate supply for aggregate demand curve is always more slanting. It won't be as steep as the aggregate supply curve. Okay, so it will be more slanting. So for the first is aggregate demand curve AD1 C plus I. Okay, now that is step 2. Now what you are finding here, at one point they both are intersecting, that is mark the point as E1, that is the level of effective demand. In our table it is the 14 lakhs level of employment, 700 crores equal to 700 crores we have seen, isn't it? That is this point E1. So this is step 3. Mark the point E1. Okay, so it is still again you can see that up to here aggregate demand price is greater than aggregate supply price. Okay, now mark this point as E1 as the underemployment equilibrium. Now what have to be done in order to reach the level of full employment? The aggregate demand curve AD1 shift to AD2, that is the green line which I have drawn here. Okay, so if the aggregate demand curve shifts from AD1 to AD2, then some sector has to come and incur the expenditure. Aggregate supply is already there. You can't do anything with aggregate supply. It will keep on increasing as the level of employment keeps on increasing. Nothing can be done. That's why effective demand depends more on aggregate demand than on aggregate supply. Okay, so now consumers are not willing to spend any more money income. Producers are not willing to spend money. So the government must interfere. So if the government interferes, then the aggregate demand curve AD1 will shift from AD1 to AD2. Okay, so when demand shifts to AD2, so this gap, that's why I have mentioned here government expenditure. So this is step 4. So we'll now draw the aggregate demand curve AD2, that is step 4. So mark it as C plus I plus G. Okay, now at point E2, that is the country has already reached the level of full employment. So mark the point after drawing the AD2, mark it as C plus I plus G. Mark the equilibrium point wherever it intersects the aggregate supply curve. Okay, so wherever it intersects the aggregate supply curve, mark the point as E2, that is step 5. And write that full employment equilibrium and connect it with the dotted lines. From E2, connect this with the dotted line, that is NF. So this is step 6. Okay, now suppose if there is a further increase in the level of aggregate demand, if the aggregate demand curve shift from AD2 to AD3, which I marked in the red line. So now this is step 7. Mark the next one, step 7. Mark it as AD3. See, for example, we have seen the national income, C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Maybe one more sector is entering into the economy. Foreign trade sector is entering into the economy. So the aggregate demand in the country increases. But what happens? The country's total 16 lakhs labor force are already employed. The country has already reached the level of full employment. So because the additional demand, nothing can be done. There will not be any production. There will not be any supply of goods and services in the country. So under that condition, demand will be more than supply. So when the demand is more than the supply, then the country will reach the full inflationary situation. That's why it is becoming a straight line like this, AS is equal to 1. So then mark this point as, put a bracket, and this area, mark this as the inflationary gap. So this is step 8. Okay, so this is how Keynes explained that the government must interfere in order to reach the level of full employment. So the same thing in words. In the above diagram, E1 is the point of equilibrium where aggregate supply is equal to aggregate demand AD1 at C plus I. So we have already seen, isn't it? E1 where first one AD is equal to aggregate supply C plus I. Okay, but at this level there is underemployment equilibrium at ON1 level of employment. According to Keynes, to reach the level of full employment ON2, the AD1 curve must, sorry, this is not ON2. You can write it as NF because in the diagram we have mentioned as NF. So you can change this to NF. Okay. So according to Keynes, to reach the level of full employment ONF, the AD1 curve C plus I must shift to AD2, that is the green line. This would be possible only with government expenditure, so that the new equilibrium between AS and AD2, that is C plus I plus G, could be reached at E2 and the economy would be at full employment. Again you change it to ONF, not ON2, change it to ONF. Because we already mentioned ONF in the diagram, it's better to mention same thing in the words also. Okay, whatever we are mentioning, it is better to use the same parameters. Okay, so at full employment equilibrium. But if there is further rise in aggregate demand, then there will be only inflation in the economy, as the country had already reached the level of full employment. Again I am changing it to ONF. Sorry, I mentioned that continuously kept on mentioning ON2. So the country has already reached the level of full employment ONF, as represented by AD3 curve in the diagram. So thus Keynes advocated the intervention of government is necessary to raise the level of effective demand and the level of employment in the economy. Okay, I hope it is clear to you. Just practice the diagram once according to the explanation. I mean, if you know the answer, remember the answer, and if you draw the diagram accordingly itself, then you will know the answer. Based on that, you can write the theory part also. So this is the format you have to write the answer. Okay, but I think I hope all the concept is clear to all of you. So if you have any doubts, please mention them in the comment box. Okay, so otherwise, if you find this video useful, please like, share and also subscribe to my YouTube channel. Okay, so until my next class, take care. Bye bye.